Institute and to this morning's session, How We Eat Now. It's another gorgeous day here in Bar Harbor, but for anyone reading the news, there are clouds on the horizon. This morning's papers said that we've passed the threshold of 150,000 dead in the United States from the COVID-19 virus, and economic figures are expected to be released today, giving us more bad news. 10% decline of US GDP in the second quarter, which is averaging out to an annual decline of over a third, 34.6%. And this is, of course, leading to deep anxiety in every household, on every campus of every size, including this one, and in major sectors of the US economy, including the food and restaurant sectors. And we're lucky today to have two experts to talk about how food will, how we are experiencing food now and how that might change in the years ahead. Those are all terrible statistics, but for millions of Americans, including this speaker, it has been a time of experimentation and occasionally even success in the kitchen as we really think about how to get food locally. And as cities and countries around the world think about building back better, sustainable food systems are certainly part of the plan. So we're lucky to have two very distinguished journalists today to share their thoughts about how we eat now. One is a new friend, Frances Stead Sellers, senior writer at the Washington Post, where she has also been a senior editor, supervising the style and the health and science sections and covering very important incidents, including the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the Deepwater Horizon spill. And in 2016, she was part of the prize-winning team covering the election and the team that wrote the book, Trump Revealed, the Definitive Biography of the 45th President. Her partner in conversation today is an old friend, Sam Sifton, the food editor of the New York Times, the founding editor of NYT Cooking, and a columnist for New York Times Magazine. He's also served as the national editor, the culture editor, and perhaps the most demanding job of all, the restaurant critic of the New York Times. And he's the author of a wonderful new book, See You on Sunday. So please join me in welcoming Sam Sifton and Frances Stead Sellers.
Thank you, Ted, and welcome, Sam, back to the Champlain Institute after a year.
Thank you. It's nice to be there virtually, I suppose.
Well, we wish you were here in person.
Me too.
We wish you were here in person. What a difference a year makes. You were on the stage here a year ago talking about cooking and conviviality. And in this recent months, you've published this wonderful book that Ted alluded to, See You on Sunday. And it's about those very themes. You talk about preparing foods for large crowds, which is exactly what we aren't able to do now. But I hope you would talk to me a little bit about the spirit of the book, the notion of bringing people together in a meaningful way around food, what that has meant to you, and what we may have lost in these past few months.
Well, I certainly didn't roll the dice very well to release a book devoted to the pleasures of the large table and welcoming the stranger into your home. But I do think the spirit holds in our pods and certainly in our families. There is no question that Americans are cooking more now with more intention, occasionally with more despair, and sometimes with more happiness. The practice of cooking has entered the family lives of millions and millions of Americans. And I'm hopeful that through, well, certainly through the book, but through my work at the Times, we can celebrate that, encourage it, and help it along, all the while reporting on the terrible issues of food insecurity, the terrible issues of our food systems, and the breakdowns in the food supply chains that are affecting many millions more Americans.
So the kinds of recipes you look at in this book that you propose for us are what I think of as sort of unscary cooking, that you can add an extra can of beans for the extra person who walks through the door, and it doesn't really matter if one ingredient might be missing, because the basic the basic process is going to work. Am I right in thinking about it that way?
You are absolutely right. Nothing matters any longer. If you don't have the beans, use a different bean. We are seeing kind of unprecedented ingredient substitution levels, which I think is fantastic. I think it's great. I think that once, you know, I think we're like I think I'm 130 days into cooking 3 squares a day, and that has led to new levels of self-confidence in the kitchen for me and for many others. And I think that self-confidence allows us to substitute, allows us to experiment, allows us to get out of ruts, allows us to experience the joy of labor, which is very different, I think, from what happens when we're staring into our screens for you and me doing journalism. It's a very different kind of work, and it's a joyful kind of work.
But tell me, Sam, how does the day in the life of Sam Sifton work? It must be full of Zoom calls. I've seen your interviews online. Your newsletters have expanded. I'm sort of beginning to think you have a bigger fiefdom than the national editor of Now. But how has your work life evolved, and how do you fit cooking into it?
Well, a very interesting thing happened at the very beginning of the pandemic, which was I was promoted and I was given a job as assistant managing editor for culture and lifestyle news. So I added to my portfolio the work of the culture desk, the work of the style desk, the work of the travel desk, which still continues as a news gathering organization, even though we're no longer celebrating trips to Crete. We picked up real estate, smarter living, all sorts of things. And that's required a huge number of meetings and calls and trying to organize remotely these disparate desks into a kind of force for good in our lives at home. And we launched a new print section at home, which is delivered with the Sunday paper. And a kind of homepage for that kind of material on nytimes.com. It's been a challenge. The days run long. At home requires another newsletter, which I'm incredibly writing twice a week, so that ups my output to 6 newsletters a week. So I'm basically a sports columnist who writes about food and the pleasures of culture and lifestyle at home, seen through your screens. And I get thrown clear of the machine at the end of the day, and then head off to the kitchen to experiment. And that's often the most joyful part of the day.
And I'm sure your inbox is filling up every day with questions, probably some complaints, comments of all sorts. What do readers crave, and how do you satisfy them?
Well, it's interesting. I think that readers crave, above all else, a sense of intimacy with the Times, and a sense of intimate connection with what it is that we're doing. They want reassurance. They want to be delivered the confidence they need to go on. I've been writing to the subscribers, and there are now close to 3 million of them, for a number of years now. And in pre-pandemic times, I would occasionally, because of the state of the world or the break of the news, need to adopt a kind of avuncular tone to say, yeah, the world outside is a dumpster fire, but you can make it a little bit better with cooking. And here are some recipes that you might want to try. And making that pivot from the real world to the world of the kitchen was and remains important to me. It's now an everyday thing. The nation is riven by social unrest. It's living with the terror of an invisible virus. There's an election coming. There's a lot of anxiety in the world and a lot of division. And it's the argument of my book that sitting around the table with friends and strangers can help heal those divisions. That's impossible now. but we can gather with our families around the table and heal ourselves. So that's what I write about, and that
Right.
lands fairly well most of the time. Sometimes the pivots are difficult.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is how very different the experience is for people living alone in apartments or with one partner in an apartment from somebody who's able to go and, stay with family and start a vegetable garden. Both are reactions people have had, or necessary changes people have had to adopt within the pandemic. And you must see those sorts of tensions play out even within New York Times readers.
Absolutely within the New York Times readership. I have to work double time to make sure that we're being truly inclusive in what we're saying. And so I will never mention a vegetable garden and a beautiful barbecue and the pleasures of the seaside without also acknowledging that there are people who are alone in small city apartments who have not been able to get out for months, and whose experiences are vastly different from others. And in celebrating that kind of inclusive sense of who we all are, I hope that we can be empathetic toward one another. I was going to say preaching. It's not really preaching, but I'm making an argument for radical empathy in how we understand how others might be experiencing their lives and their cooking lives during the pandemic.
And of course, not only restaurant workers, but migrant workers have been some of the people who have been most affected by COVID. I was at a food bank in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, not very long ago, among the mushroom working community, where the coronavirus pandemic has hit very hard and people have lost jobs. You must be seeing that not only in food chains, but understanding that as part of the whole food production and the impact this pandemic has had on individuals across the country, and some of the most vulnerable.
Yes, some of the very most vulnerable. We see the outbreaks in processing plants for poultry, for beef and pork, where workers are side by side in under stressful conditions for hours and hours. They're asked to come to work even when they're sick, and the outbreaks can wipe out a plant in a matter of days. Meanwhile, as you note, migrant workers are having a terrible time of it, and farmers are having a terrible time of it. So where does some of this food go? We're seeing, one of the interesting things about running food coverage is you're always thinking about Thanksgiving, right? So now we're in the process, in these warm days, we're in the process of thinking, like, what's going to happen with Thanksgiving 2020? What are the stories that we should be attacking as we head toward that season? Of course, we'll figure out ways to have much smaller Thanksgivings, and we'll have plenty of advice there. But there's also news to cover. As but one example, think about turkeys, those massive 20 and 22, 23 pound birds that form the centerpiece of these Norman Rockwell meals that we celebrate as Americans. They're in the fields right now growing. What kind of market is there going to be for a full-size adult turkey of 22 pounds in 2020? Where are those birds going to go? Who's going to process them? Are we going to see a situation, as we've seen with some produce farmers, where stock is going to be just killed and dumped? And it's a really scary thing to think about what's going to happen as the harvest season comes online. In Maine, where there are a number of small farms that can kind of pivot toward farmers markets, pivot toward truck farming. That's very different in the kind of industrial Midwest, where you have massive farming outfits. And where's that stuff going to go? And that's going to be a big reporting target for us in the coming months.
Do you think that we could be at the beginning of a sort of long-term upheaval in the way food is produced in this country? And can we even reform a way in which food can be produced in small farms locally?
I want to be clear. I think we are at the beginning of a transformation of how this works. It's very interesting to me the degree to which small farmers in particular have been able to change their businesses slightly in order not necessarily to thrive, but to survive during the pandemic. And this is happening across all the wide rainbow of agricultural activity, up to and including aquaculture. I'm really interested to see the degree to which where I am on Eastern Long Island, commercial oyster farmers have pivoted to a retail business where they used to sell exclusively to high-end restaurants and now sell to individuals. And what's fascinating about that is that it completely changes the buyer's relationship to the foodstuff. Oysters, we think of a year ago, we thought of as kind of a luxurious thing, part of a seafood tower that you purchased in a French bistro to accompany your icy Sancerre, and they cost a fair amount of money, right? It was like $3 an oyster. Now, those same farms are selling at $1 a piece or 75 cents a piece, and Americans are figuring out how to open them on their own, how to bake them and grill them and use them in stews, and suddenly the oyster, this symbol of elevated bistro lifestyle, becomes just another ingredient in the kitchen, and that's kind of exciting to think about. Where else are we going to see that happening? I'm eager to find out the answer to that question. That's another line of reporting we'll be chasing.
It's fascinating. I saw some of the same thing happening outside Philadelphia recently with somebody who'd been growing microgreens for high-end restaurants. And part of his pivot to feeding people directly was, he told me, I think I need to start growing more real food. And he meant food to send to food kitchens and other places where there was food insecurity. So root crops, those sorts of vegetables rather than highly perishable microgreens.
That's correct. And microgreens, of course, if you let them go, become greens. And then you can, then they're much more useful for people in their home kitchens. Because in our home kitchens, we're not cooking with tweezers, and we're not, plating as if for a Escoffier or to impress a restaurant critic. It's and I think that's probably a good thing.
Right, absolutely, and that's actually why your book, even though it's for cooking for sort of 4 to 6 people, and maybe that's going to be possible going ahead, but these sorts of recipes remain relevant, right? They're unscary, sort of unfussy.
Well, that's the idea. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is there are only like 11 recipes in the whole world. And it's it's up to us in the food game to riff on them. And heretofore, we've done that in ways that make it seem as if, like it could be scary. And it's not scary. It shouldn't be scary. Once you learn to grill, you learn to grill. Once you learn to saute, you know how to saute. Once you know how to braise, you can braise. And then it's just layering in flavors on top of that. I hope that we can be of assistance in making that delicious. But most of all, I hope we can be of assistance in making it seem possible and part of your life.
Are there particular cookbook writers who you see as models of this kind of cooking? You have a blurb from Nigella, a British cook, on the back, which might strike some people as surprising or amusing. But of course, she wrote her wonderful book, Feast, about feeding large crowds of people. Who are your sort of role models in this way of thinking about food?
Well, I look to the past, like my friend Ted. I look to the past a lot to understand the present and the future. And I think that if you look at the work of Elizabeth David, of M.F.K. Fisher, of Laurie Colwin, you see a kind of narrative recipe style that is dependent on an basic understanding of how to cook, and then it's just advice from there. And so I look to those three women a lot, but at the same time, I'm fascinated by the workings of the professional kitchen and how that can help us in the home. And so Gabrielle Hamilton, my colleague on the Times and the owner and co-chef at Prune Restaurant in New York, her cookbook, the Prune Cookbook, which is essentially like a manual that would allow you to cook in her restaurant. If you were able to make it all the way through and nail every recipe. She's very, very almost Germanic in how fierce she is about executing on the recipes. If you did that, you'd be a pretty good line cook. And I've found in matters of technique that looking to the professional chefs is helpful, but I'm a narrative guy, and I want to write through the recipes. And so I like to look to Fisher. I like to look, and I like to look at Laurie Coleman.
Right. In your career at the New York Times, you've held some very high-powered positions, national editor among them. As a food writer and now covering all this other cultural coverage, I would think you're somewhat removed from some of the most vitriolic attacks on the Times. Does the food editor get accusations of fake news, or are you removed from that whole debate at the moment?
Well, we ran a recipe for green pea guacamole once, and we got plenty of fake news on that one. President Obama even tweeted that it was not a real guacamole. So yeah, we get it sometimes. But you know, one of the interesting things about the Times is that even its most vitriolic opponents or critics allow that some parts of the paper are okay. When I was national editor, I recall being in a very red state, a very red small town, talking with a farmer who really did not like the New York Times and did not want to cooperate with a national story. But then amazingly allowed that Eric Asimov's a pretty good wine critic. And I thought, wow. Where we do get attacked sometimes is when we connect the world of food and cooking to the world outside. I feel passionately that the creation and consumption of dinner is a place where everything is going to be discussed. And you can't roast a chicken in the middle of a pandemic during a period of social unrest while we face a historic election and not think that somehow that's going to affect what we're talking about and how we're experiencing the meal. When the national mood is dark, I can see it in the numbers on NYT Cooking that the desire for comfort foods goes up. It's axiomatic that when the news is terrible, cooking's numbers are up because people seek solace in food. They seek solace in the kitchen. And when we make that correlation explicit, I do get a small number, sometimes more than a small number, of responses that say, you know, stick to food, stick to the kitchen. I refuse to do that.
How much are your reporters and columnists able at this point to be out in the community? It's something I, as a reporter, have loved to do and learned a lot from people across the whole country. And I am concerned sometimes that we've had to step back and do more of our reporting on our phones, using FaceTime, using all the tools we can, but without traveling as much. How is that affecting the coverage that you oversee?
I was having a conversation about this with Kim Severson, who's a national reporter, was a national reporter when I was national editor, now is a food reporter based in Atlanta, who covers the nation. She and I traveled before the pandemic a lot. And we had a conversation about how much we're missing it, how much we're missing being on the road, missing our, anonymous Marriott hotel rooms, missing meeting people out in the world, and wondering at what point is it going to be okay for us to go out again and report again, properly masked with all the PPE requirements met. And I suspect it's going to be fairly soon. We're seeing some of our political reporters out on the road. Our national reporters are out on the streets a lot, and I think that shows in the quality of reporting that the Times is doing from Portland, from Minneapolis, and elsewhere. In the world of food, we've been talking about farms. We talked about that turkey story. Well, I don't think we'll be able to tell those stories without going out and seeing what's happening. So I guess sort of tentatively, as the summer continues and heads into fall, we're going to see what it looks like to drive out into the world.
Yeah, we've had a lot of collaborations. We have something called the Talent Network, which links up with qualified journalists around the country. And of course, there are many who would love to be writing for the Washington Post. And so we do a lot of joint byline work at the moment with people who are based out in the country when we can't. That was something that was evolving before this pandemic and has really proved its value. You have a big staff across the country as well, right?
Yes, we do. We're in 13 news bureaus around the United States, not including the New York metro area or Washington, D.C. And we've entered into some really interesting strategic partnerships with journalists from smaller market cities and smaller market areas, some of whom have been laid off, others of whom are doing their projects with their newspaper and with us. So the same sort of joint byline situation, but the story shows up in the hometown paper and in the national paper, and that's been exciting and good. But I do know that there's a fierce desire to travel, to see the world, and I think we'll see that starting to come back. You're seeing it some in the work that we're already doing. Tyler Hicks, our photographer, had that great story earlier this week, end of last week, this weekend, I guess, about traveling on the Amazon to see the effects of the coronavirus in these tiny towns. No one had been there. And it must have been scary, difficult work out there, masked and gloved and the like. But he bore witness. That's the job. And I know there are a lot of people in the Times newsroom and in the Post newsroom who want to do the same.
Right. And I think we're seeing more collaborations also between writers and photographers. So only one is out. You're dividing the work of being out there, but working together on both telling the story and illustrating it, or telling it visually as well. I'm sure you're like Tyler's wonderful piece this weekend.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And it's interesting. We're even seeing it in video as well. One of our reporters who's been covering the Portland protests, a lot of his work has come out of his Twitter feed and out of the video setting on his iPhone. We've been able to build kind of incredible storytelling out of that. And I guess, there's some exciting things about the technology that we can now use, and storytelling is changing as a result.
Both your institution and mine have sort of changed the business model that was one that was based on advertising to a subscription-based model. And I think probably quite a lot of listeners would like to understand how that has made these big papers successful, and also what it could mean for local journalism, which is suffering so much. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I think that the shift to a subscription model for the New York Times has been what's been successful. We're at 6 million subscribers, but it's also incredibly thrilling to work directly for our readers. That's what we're doing.
Right.
If you look at an advertising model, you're working for advertisers. Even if you declare your editorial independence, and even if you support your editorial independence, at the end of the day, you're creating adjacencies for ads. That's what led to those huge 7-pound Sunday New York Times sections of 20 years ago, with these lush sections filled with luxury advertising and lots of articles about watches and hemlines and house and home. We had the travel section was filled with cruise advertising. And so we wrote a lot about cruises. Well, in the pandemic, the cruise industry is in real trouble, and cruises are dangerous, and we can write about that to the benefit of the reader. It's really exciting to be able to do that. I like working for our subscribers. I chafe at the idea that we would build something for an advertiser, although we're happy to do it. There's still some ad revenue out there, but it's thrilling to work for subscribers. How that works for smaller papers is interesting. The problem that smaller papers are facing right now is that they're being gutted from the inside, and there's no investment in the newsroom. And if there's no investment in the newsroom, you can't create a product that serves the reader in such a way that he or she would want to pay for the privilege of reading it. There's a direct correlation between investment in news and payoff in subscriptions. That if there's an owner who's brave enough to do that, there are, as your organization proves and as the Times proves, there's a market for it. In smaller markets as well, there still is advertising revenue. It's not big and it's not getting bigger, but it's still there a little bit. And I'm hoping that a combination of the two, an investment in newsroom strategy, a turn toward the subscription business, and the remnants of legacy print advertising can maybe bring the best of those papers back, but only if there's significant investment in the newsroom.
I think many, as we know, big institutions and corporations have been riven in the wake of George Floyd's death and the reawakening of the Black Lives Matter movement. How has that affected your newsroom, and how have people responded there?
It's been a difficult and tense time, but I'm very hopeful about our future. A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, Mark Thompson, the CEO, Merritt Coppett Levin, who's going to be the CEO when Mark retires in September, have put their efforts full bore behind a strategy of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we think can fundamentally transform the culture of the New York Times and make it a place where every employee wants to come to work and feels valued and feels heard. There are efforts ongoing, some of which predated George Floyd, others of which have been spun up quite quickly, that I think will take their time and do their diligence, because speed is an enemy of true work like this. Speed is an enemy of inclusion, but we're working with real urgency to transform the culture of the place and make it a truly inclusive, equitable institution that will, by dint of doing that, be diverse. We're committed to serving the nation that we write about, and we want our newsroom to look and feel like our readers and our potential readers.
And it's also very true in a newspaper or newsroom that you get a different kind of story, of course. You understand the world differently when you have a diversity of people bringing you those stories. Reporters, we need to hear from reporters, right, who come from different backgrounds and understand the world differently from one another.
That's exactly right. And those stories need to be edited by a diverse group of people who see the world in different ways. And, you know, that diversity is not simply racial. It's also about socioeconomic backgrounds. It's about geography. It's about loads and loads of things. But mostly, or not even mostly, but equally important, is this question of, are you being heard? We're skeptical people, journalists. But if that skepticism isn't allowed to be voiced freely by all, we get into trouble. So we're working on that as well.
You talked at the beginning of our conversation about empathy, and last Sunday you made a great appeal in your column for people to do something for somebody else. What was the response to that particular column? Did you hear about things that people were actually doing? Have they written back to you?
I heard from a lot of people on that particular column, a lot of thanks. And yeah, there were some people, virtue signaled and told me exactly what they did, but it was more, the bulk of the response was gratitude for saying it, for saying that, we're all experiencing this moment in American history in different ways. And it's really important to remember that always, and to be empathetic with others, and to try and walk a mile in their shoes, or walk a mile in their shoes and help them in some way. And I also talked at the beginning of this about intimacy, and I think empathy and doing things for others is intimate. It's an intimate act, and it brings us closer together as people, and helps us understand the world, which is the primary mission of the New York Times. So it's very much, I hope, on brand.
I'm going to turn to listener questions in a bit, but I have one question I really want to ask about innovations now, and whether that spirit we talked about in the beginning of bringing people together can happen online. A friend of mine recently introduced me to a London-based nonprofit called Migrateful, in which immigrant cooks send you a list of ingredients. You go out shopping, and then you can cook with them and have your dinner prepared and learn about their culture as you go. A means of bridging a divide. I thought it was innovative and a wonderful way to use the technology to build bridges. Are you seeing other means of building bridges, of overcoming these divides in this extraordinarily polarized time we're living through?
Absolutely, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in the journalism we do in the core food section, but we're seeing it perhaps especially so in the worlds of social media. So there's an NYT cooking Facebook group. It's massive, and it's an incredibly supportive place where people are doing kind of ad hoc versions of just what you're talking about, sharing recipes and techniques and stories and backgrounds. We see it in the work our social media editors are doing in storytelling on Instagram, in videos on YouTube and the like. And it's gratifying to see the degree to which we can take people, I'm going to sound like Mark Zuckerberg now for a minute, we can take people off the platform, right? We can migrate them away from the New York Times to experience something on another platform, and then know that they're going to come back. One of the experiments I ran recently, not as food editor, but as assistant managing editor, was to commission a whole bunch of Google Docs written by Times journalists. We gave them very little guidance other than to say, what are you doing during the pandemic? What do you got going on? And to a man and woman, they all had something interesting to say that was extremely revealing about who they are as journalists and people, and extremely helpful in that it introduced readers to books and music and art and novels that they never would have experienced but for these informal lists that the that the journalists put together and that we were able to put on the homepage of the New York Times, like an actual Google Doc. We got a note from an art director of another paper on the West Coast. I won't name it, but he was complimenting us on our art direction and how well we mimicked the look and feel of a Google Doc. No, dude, that's a Google Doc. Like, that's what we did, and it was really, and it did just what you're saying. It's so sweet.
Is that, I would love to ask you before we turn to reader questions, what's the one thing you really hope won't go away once we get rid of COVID?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, I'm as you might say, I'm gobsmacked by that question. I don't know what to answer. I think that there's a degree of flexibility to the work that we do now, even though it seems endless. I think when this is all over, it would be nice if we could maintain a little bit of the kind of work from home, work-life balance stuff. I really don't like commuting. I love traveling. I don't like commuting. And it's been thrilling to get that time back. So I hope it would be great if I never had to commute again.
Good. Well, I have a long commute too, and I concur. So let me ask you some of the questions that have been coming in. First one is from, and I'm going to be reading them, Anonymous. What do you think will change after COVID about how we get together and eat together?
Well, that depends on the vaccine, right? I think we're social animals. If there's a vaccine, if we have herd immunity, like, we'll go back to how we were before fairly quickly. We see the desire for people to be together and all the, irresponsible, maskless parties and bars and the like. If we don't, if we just sort of get through it and there are still flare-ups, it's, dinner parties are going to be weird. I think, and I say this as a parent, but also as an American, I think we're going to see a lot more cleanliness. There's going to be a lot more, people come into your home, they're going to go straight to the sink and wash their hands. But if we get that vaccine, I bet we're back to crowded dinner parties and lovely houses right quick.
One does wonder about the architecture of restaurants as well, whether we'll wash our hands going in and that sort of thing before sitting down. You worry about restaurant workers in these transitional phases.
That's absolutely right.
As the client, I meant.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's going to be, like, restaurants aren't coming back anytime soon. Like, it's wonderful to be able to go and eat on a sidewalk table at a restaurant after months and months of lockdown. But come the fall, it's just not tenable to have 4 tables that turn 3 times over the course of an evening. So restaurants it's going to be a while till they come back and come back well. So
another question, what's your favorite improvised meal you've whipped up during the pandemic?
Oh boy, there have been a lot, but I did a sort of hack on a kind of, I was desperately missing bad Chinese food, by which I mean Chinese American food of the sort that you might get at a dodgy little place on the outskirts of town, takeout style. And so I made a big sticky, almost General Tso's like sauce out of gochujang, the Korean red pepper paste, and ketchup, and some rice wine, a lot of garlic and ginger. And you could put that on a shoe and it would taste pretty good. I've done it with chicken, and I've done it with fried tofu, and it just went over like on rice with some greens on the side. I was like the king of the kitchen. Everyone loved it.
So you touched on this, but I'm going to ask the question from the viewer. What's your sense of what will happen to the restaurant scene in New York and other cities? What will come back first? What won't come back at all?
Well, what's gonna come back first is kind of the small restaurants that can make sandwiches and pizza and takeout food. You know, they'll be first back. Last back, I think, are going to be the mid-tier restaurants, because if you think about super fancy restaurants, they could pivot to a kind of bespoke experience where you spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to own the table for the whole night, and you're waited on like a king or a queen. But the middle ground, those sort of neighborhood restaurants that are crowded and bustling and serve roast chicken and chilled wine, like, it's going to be hard for them to come back because of the social distancing required to pull it off. And I wonder if they'll ever come back. A lot of those restaurateurs have changed their business models and become something more like a general store that sells some prepared food and a lot of ingredients. So we'll have to see. But I think in New York City in particular, we're going to lose a lot of restaurants, like a lot.
Wow. Have you eaten out at a restaurant yet since the pandemic?
No, I don't. No, that's not true. I did eat at a sidewalk table here in Greenport, New York. And on the one hand, it was thrilling. It was nice to be given food rather than preparing food. But on the other hand, I was like, this isn't very good. And it's super stressful. And I'm worried about everything. And no, I don't want to go to a restaurant. So that was my one shot. I don't think I'm going to do it again anytime soon.
We've done it once too. And another reader question. Here we go. Do you have hope that COVID will lead to more governmental support for people facing food insecurity?
Well, I always have hope. I'm a hopeful person, but I don't see much evidence at all that there's going to be more governmental support for people facing food insecurity. What I have seen and what leads me to hope is the extraordinary efforts of individuals and groups of civilians all across the country in building food banks and in hosting food pantries. And we see those individuals working and groups working with farmers directly in order to address issues of food insecurity. And that gives me some hope that we'll be able to meet these issues. But you know, the mess that, you know, it seems crazy right now to be talking about the Farm Bill, and but like, you know, SNAP benefits are a mess right now. And we'll have to see come November which direction we're going to go.
When I mentioned I'd been at a food bank earlier on this year, and realized when I went there that many nonprofits of that kind are staffed largely by people who have retired. And this particular food bank had to staff up entirely a new group of people because older people couldn't risk potential infection with the virus. And I think that's probably a huge struggle and an underreported struggle across the country of nonprofits losing the people they most rely on.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I think that we're gonna have to see how these organizations set themselves up for success and what that really looks like. Are you targeting particular communities or particular demographics, or throwing it open widely, as in the Sikh model, where anyone can come and be fed? Again, we will have to see. This is yet another great line of reporting for coming months.
And another question here, another anonymous one. It's interesting. Nobody wants to give their name. A running theme this week is cancel culture. Can you speak to what happened to Alison Roman and why?
So a running theme this year is cancel culture. I'm not going to speak about Alison Roman, who has been a contributor to the Times, because we just don't talk about personnel matters, and that's but I will say that there is this amazing and important conversation that's developing in the food world right now over questions of recipe ownership and credit for recipes. One of the kind of things that we're most proud of at NYT Cooking is that there's a lot of reporting that goes into our recipes, and we use the top note at the top of each recipe to kind of tell the story of that reporting, to show our work. But I think one of the things that I've realized is that how we frame that storytelling, how we byline, how we design the page itself, what we call the recipe detail page, matters a great deal. And we're undergoing a lot of good and important work right now to refine that, to make sure that when we present a recipe, we explain clearly and accurately where the recipe comes from, who originally developed it, who adapted it, who did the reporting, in order to make sure that we're presenting a truly inclusive report on a particular recipe and telling its story accurately, fairly, and well. So this discussion that has led to the cancellation of some people is a good one and an important one.
So at the Washington Post, we've had a wonderful testing kitchen, and one of the great perks in the past has been to be sent a recipe, to make it at home, share some of it with your family, and then bring in what you've cooked to make sure that the recipe works before it's printed for viewers. What do you do? Do you have a test kitchen now? How are you managing the process of testing food to make sure those recipes work for people?
The Times has not had a test kitchen in many years, and I used to be mad about that. I'm not mad about it anymore, because we've built up such a marvelous testing mechanism that works so well, using a big network of freelance recipe testers all across the country, working at different altitudes in different sorts of kitchens. And what holds them all together is our style guide and the fact that they're all home kitchens. I find that in some kind of industrial test kitchens, I'm not calling the Washington Post test kitchen an industrial one, but in some of the magazines and the like, where they're cooking on kind of almost restaurant quality equipment, the recipes may work pretty well, but they're not bulletproof. I like to think that ours come close to being bulletproof because they're tested in kitchens just like our readers' kitchens, and all over the place as well. So we can keep an eye on the availability of ingredients, so we can keep an eye on how it works at altitude and the like. That said, we're very excited at the Times to be in the process of building a studio kitchen in Midtown Manhattan that we're all looking forward to getting into at some point in the coming months, where we can, if not test recipes, certainly make and display recipes in video and in print. And that's a really exciting moment for us.
Another reader question for you. One of the wonderful things now is people sharing their food on sites like Quarantine Kitchen. Can you talk about your favorite food sites other than your own?
Well, are there other food sites? I'm not sure.
Hey.
No, I kid. I'm a bit of an Instagram addict, and I really like scrolling through Instagram, not so much for inspiration, or not so much for culinary inspiration, but for inspiration about what it is Americans are cooking and how they're serving it and what they're doing. And I see marvelous stuff there. I see horrifying stuff there. And all of it kind of, I realize this isn't the greatest answer in the world, but Instagram is a food site.
Right.
And I find great pleasure in kind of anxiety scrolling through it late at night and thinking, oh, wow, maybe I should grill a pizza.
I think we've probably got time for one last reader question, which comes from Morgan. I don't know if it's Lavoie or Lavoie. If the Institute were to do a food and food systems themed Champlain Institute, who would you bring?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I'd bring some usual suspects. It'd be good to have Michael Pollan on the island. Alice Waters would be nice to have on the island. The writer and thinker Michael Twitty would be an interesting character to have. Kim Severson from the New York Times would be a good person to bring in. And then, yeah, that could be kind of cool. Tom Colicchio, the celebrity chef, is pretty interesting on these subjects, and would be interesting to have. And that's the start. I think I could get a couple good panels out of that. And then we could brainstorm others. Okay, Lynn Bolger, well, let's get this going.
Please don't forget me. Please don't forget me. Oh. Add me to the list.
We will be at the very top of the list. You and me, Frances.
Sam Sifton, thank you so much for joining us. It was fantastic to talk to you through the I guess, trials and tribulations. It's a terrible cliche, but the ups and downs of this period and all you've been doing to innovate and bringing empathy through food, making it meaningful for people who are managing through the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frances. And thank you, Lynn, for inviting me. And I'm sorry I'm not on the island. I look forward to being there next year in person.
Great. It sounds like we've got a lineup already for next year with some great food speakers. And Sam and Frances will be back. How lucky we are to have Frances here, summering on the island. At 11, we have another Frances joining us. It's Frances Fitzgerald, the writer of The Evangelicals. She will be talking with Roxana Robinson, the author and environmental activist, about how the evangelical bloc does or does not vote, all for a Republican, and what that means for our November 3rd. See you at 11. See you then.